For native Australians, the arrival of UK Novoslav in 1788 certainly noted the begin of eviction, abuse and policies how would reason generations of damage. But latter study has as well taken into account more than understanding in how indigenous groups utilized several colonialist technique to their benefit, legacy expert tell. Archaeologists trust how native tribes designed conventional toolkit of silicon paving how had been utilized as counterweight on UK sea vessels. Next the arrival of the condemned ware for the deceased 18th and previous 19th centuries. Experts say the rock patchy were largest potential thrown on arrive in Sydney. The material were later undertaken by or taking into account to coast indigenous families, who lived in which is now the prestigious Sydney outskirts of Randwick. It was down there how workers in 2016 unsecured which was mined to be a treasure of indigenous artifacts. More than rather than 30,000 trimming of rock were restored, initially by opportunity, among job on a lighting railing link. Yet, following thorough investigations, archaeologists now trust how just 100 to 200 are culturally considerable items. Lot of the rock patchy were done of silicon, a kind of fate not found in Sydney. Dr. Tim Owen, an archaeologist of advisor team GML Legacy, told down there was irresistible testimony how the silicon had been processed for toolkit in compliance in usual indigenous experience. It shows it is a conventional location how indigenous human beings include been with. While they production indigenous objects they don't fair hit rock along, they use really particular techniques to in fact job the fate downward in profiled trimming. We include identified a quantity of trimming how include really certain points of percussion instrument. To discover the resource of the silicon, Dr. Owen's inquiry took him to the some party of the planet, to the turbid edges of the Thames close a location wherever condemned sea vessels were one day produced and laden in counterweight for their length voyages to Sydney. I went to the near periodic mud flats I could to the factual X dockyard at Deptford and gathered content, he told. I gathered about 50 or so samples of production of all the various colors I could view, and all the various state of creature survived and bashed. The London shingle were compared to such unearthed in Sydney, and following judicial analyse they all were found to be chemically identical. The original opening in Sydney as well driven debate, yet. In 2016, a team of Indigenous older generation named for job on the lighting railing link to be halted, quoting the Indigenous Legacy Protect Act 1984. I'd love to see it stopped and the region classed as an Indigenous Legacy region, Derek Senior Gaffer Day Dyer said the ABC at the period. But the Fed by the government discarded the request. It told the website was not at hazard of creature defiled, and did not drop during the scale of the instrument. The newest artifacts are not the just opening of their type in Sydney. In the 1980s and 90s, excavations on the website of the at first by the government building, wherever the Museum of Sydney now sits shut to the harbour, show more than rather than 20 native artifacts. They turned on rock inventory, items molded of window and, love the content unearthed in Randwick, toolkit done of imported silicon. It, too much, had the identical chemistry sign as the difficult fate of London. For Beta Heiss of Sydney Residing Museums, that manages the website of Old by the Government Building, the study has helping to light the ways how Indigenous human beings betrothed in the previous settlement. They incurred tremendously of the present of Europeans and the destruction to their civilization and the eviction of their earth, but however they tailored to their new occasion, she told. They understood wherever they necessary to do alliances. She told the opening helping report a brand new way of thought on such previous year of the settlement. Down there isn't a precise share among the Indigenous story and the Europe story, she told. Down there is a large transactions of interconnection among the couple. Indigenous human beings were navigation a scenery that was a scrappy of abuse and hostility on one brush and amity and connect on else, or, of year, ever resistance the intrusion. Indigenous leaders complain about how their ancestors were airbrushed of the story of the previous settlement in Sydney. We were elastic and adaptable to new technique how came in the colonizers, told Chris Ingree, of the La Perouse Regional Indigenous Earth Justice. It wasn't fair rock material. It was metal, and a lot of our Indigenous families in Coast Sydney how betrothed in the economics among 1790 all the way up to the deceased 1800s would use Europe boats to run fishery enterprises. Ours old human beings would search in rifles instead of spears. They selected up the Europe technique rather rapidly and utilized it to their own benefit. But such days would ultimately wither while authoritative law was gone. How future smothered freedoms for Indigenous Australians. It wasn't before the Indigenous Protect Executive Board was entered in New Southward Wales in 1883-84 how draconic laws and policies were entered to monitoring folk lives, Mr. Ingree told. Preliminary to how Indigenous human beings lived steadily fleeing their own business community and were betrothed in the regional economics. Lot more than stories of Sydney's facility and wealthy colonialist history stay lie by its gateway, offices and suburban area, but they are secrets how may never see the lighting of date.